What's going on, guys? Dare here with Fantasy Football Advice, coming at you with another fantasy football video. Today, we are going over overhyped players that are actually worth the hype. Every offseason, there are several players who get a ton of buzz, and the whole fantasy community generally tries to target these players. It does typically inflate their ADP, but not all of them are actually worth it. In this video, we'll go over a handful of players that we do believe are actually worth the hype. Before we do get into the video though, stat of the day. Today's stat of the day: which wide receiver averaged the most separation on his targets? Leave your answer in the comment section down below. We'll be happy to let you know who wins in tomorrow's video. Also, guys, consider signing up for our draft package. It's loaded with information and you get full access to the website all offseason and during the season. I can't stress enough how great of a value this draft package actually is. So if you're interested or just curious, consider checking out our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. Link, as always, in the description box below. With all that out of the way though, let's get into today's video, and the first player I wanted to talk about is Diontae Johnson. This is definitely a player that a lot of the fantasy community is pretty high on. It's almost as if we can't go a day on Twitter without seeing something about Diontae Johnson hyping him up, but if you ask us, it's for good reason. He finished his 2019 rookie campaign with 680 yards. He did that on 59 receptions. He also did have 5 receiving touchdowns, added another one in the return game as well. Ultimately, he finished the season as wide receiver 41. Not a bad fantasy finish for a rookie, let alone one that had a carousel of quarterbacks, none of which were actually all that good. So for him to even perform as wide receiver 41, it was pretty impressive. There was no Juju last season though, but we still didn't see that lead to more opportunities, at least not early on. Despite Juju being banged up for most of the season, Diontae Johnson only played on 65% of snaps. He was actually outsnapped by James Washington, and I know that shouldn't be too much of a surprise. Typically rookie wide receivers, they have to work their way up the depth chart, but we've seen James Washington play extremely inconsistent throughout his young career, but what we saw from Diontae Johnson was much more promising. We should see him easily outsnap James Washington this season and be primed for that number 2 wide receiver slot on this offense. And in past seasons with Big Ben, when there was Antonio Brown and Juju Smith-Schuster on the field at the same time, both of which played a massive amount of snaps. Antonio Brown, the leading receiver on that team, played on 95% of snaps, and Juju played on 86% of snaps. It's definitely a good sign that this offense with Big Ben historically has heavy involvement from the wide receiver too. Digressing back to the poor quarterback play, Diontae Johnson boasted a 64.1% catch rate, which isn't all that good. It ranked 48th in the league, so definitely something we also see going up. A healthy Big Ben is a massive upgrade over the other quarterbacks that played last season, but even that catch rate where he ranked 48th in the league, it doesn't tell you the true story. You have to factor in what percentage of his balls were actually catchable, and for those catchable balls, how many of those was he able to secure? Well, he actually had a fantastic true catch rate of 88.1%. That ranked 16th in the league. What that means is he's going to easily turn his targets into receptions, aka more fantasy points for your team. We should also expect that catchable target percentage to go up, and even if you do lie in the camp of Big Ben possibly returning rusty, even in that scenario, there is no way that Big Ben performs worse than the quarterbacks he had last season. One other thing of note is that he did deal with a groin injury reportedly in week 2. A groin injury is definitely the type of injury that can linger, and considering it did lead to a sports hernia surgery, it's safe to assume that he wasn't even playing at 100% health, yet was still able to perform very well. That leaves a lot of potential for upside. Currently, Diontae Johnson is coming off the board at around wide receiver 43, 2 spots lower than his fantasy finish last season of wide receiver 41, so to be able to get him currently in the 10th round makes him not only a pick that has a massive amount of upside, but also one that's coming in at a value. Like I said though, there has been a ton of buzz around Diontae Johnson this offseason, so I wouldn't be surprised if his ADP does climb up, but even so, we have him ranked inside the top 40. Even if he does climb up draft boards, it's very possible we may still consider him a value and a player to target in that range. So overall, to summarize, Diontae Johnson definitely showed a ton of promise last season, and based on the snaps and the way they were trending last season, it's safe to assume he is going to be the second wide receiver on this team when it comes to volume and production. Even though he performed solid for fantasy last season, the quarterback play was terrible, so we're definitely getting an upgrade there. He's a top 20 wide receiver when it comes to his true catch rate, so if we can improve on the catchable target percentage, you can guarantee he'll be putting up fantasy points consistently. It's a pretty safe assumption that's going to happen, and Big Ben does have a history of being able to support 2 fantasy relevant wide receivers, even thinking most recently with Antonio Brown Saquon and Juju Smith-Schuster both ended up actually finishing as wide receiver ones in 2018, and right now he's currently being drafted at a lower spot than what he finished at last season. So for us, it's definitely a player who's getting a ton of hype that we do actually think is worth it in drafts. Let's move on to the next player though. The next player we have is Miles Sanders of the Philadelphia Eagles. Sanders' rookie season can definitely be summarized as an overall success. He finished the 2019 season as the running back 15, returning fantasy value to anybody that drafted him. The only issue is he did get off to a slow start. We saw early on he was competing for snaps, mostly with Jordan Howard. That definitely ate into his production, but as soon as Jordan Howard was virtually out of the picture, we saw Miles Sanders' fantasy value completely skyrocket. He went from averaging just over 10 touches per game through the first 9 weeks and closed out through the final 7, averaging just under 20 touches per game. For reference, that's a similar volume total to what Dalvin Cook was able to put together last season. So what that tells us is if he's able to receive that level of volume, it's enough to potentially post top 5 running back numbers. From what we saw from him last season, we know the talent's there. He already proved to be one of the better pass catching backs in the entire league. He caught 79% of the balls that came his way. He only dropped 2 passes for the entire season, and through the final 7 weeks of the season, when he was seeing a high percentage of snaps, he had 5 or more targets in 6 of 7 games. That 7th game was 4 targets, and if you're getting that level of volume in the receiving game, that's going to give you a very safe floor. What we also know is he's running behind a very good offensive line. It's also a team that puts up plenty of points throughout the season offensively, so his 6th rushing touchdown that he was able to put together in 2019 is definitely a figure we see going up. One major factor that is going to impact his fantasy value will be the result of this team signing an additional running back or not, and who that running back is. But so far, the roster has Boston Scott and Miles Sanders. Boston Scott is in no way a threat to take touches from Sanders, and while historically this has been a team that likes to use a running back by committee approach, when they had the choice of those same weapons and Jordan Howard wasn't on the field, there was no committee. Now they're heading into the season with essentially the same roster in the backfield, so it's pretty safe to assume that the production and volume is going to mirror that which we saw at the end of the season as opposed to what we saw at the early part of the season. I've heard people voice concerns over Boston Scott and him potentially taking away some of the work in the receiving game that Miles Sanders is expected to receive. While it's true he will see targets while Sanders is healthy, the team would 100% prefer to go with the talent of Miles Sanders in that area, and Boston Scott is zero threat to take any touches in the goal line. He simply doesn't have the build to fill that role, and last season he ranked outside the top 60 when it comes to his touch percentage in the red zone. Currently, Miles Sanders is going as the running back 12. In mock drafts, I've seen him drafted much higher than that, but currently he's behind players like Aaron Jones. As we know, Aaron Jones led the league in rushing touchdowns. When it comes to touchdowns, there is typically some variance there. He'll definitely be hard pressed to repeat that performance and post 16 touchdowns. Sanders is also going behind players like Josh Jacobs, who's on a much worse offense and is used significantly less in the receiving game, which is very valuable considering today's leagues are mostly PPR or half PPR. We actually have Miles Sanders ranked ahead of both of those players. Currently, we have him ranked as the RB7, which is 5 spots above ADP and also 5 spots above the experts' consensus rankings. If you would be able to get Miles Sanders as the RB12, that is a complete steal. I definitely don't suspect him to fall that far, especially if they don't sign anybody and add more depth to the backfield, but we expect big things from Sanders this year. We feel 100% comfortable with having him as our RB1, and just knowing there's the potential to have him as the second running back on your roster, the hype on this player is 100% warranted. The final player we have is DK Metcalf of the Seattle Seahawks. Currently, we have him ranked as the wide receiver 20, once again higher than ADP, as well as experts' consensus rankings, which should tell you we are big fans of taking DK Metcalf. We've taken him in several mock drafts, and he's coming off the board in a range where there are several wide receivers that have some question marks. Most people would possibly classify DK Metcalf as somewhat of a risky pick. We typically try to avoid risk in those early rounds, but since we do have him as a target, that should let you know we don't think he's as risky as the general public may think. DK Metcalf is an insane athlete that can't be understated. His 4.33 40 time is in the 99th percentile. His speed score also in the 99th percentile. His burst as well as catch radius, 90th plus percentile as well. Not to mention, he's 6'3", 228 pounds, so he does bring that combination of size and speed. He's always a threat for a big play. His 15.5 yards per reception last season was good for a top 15 finish when compared to receivers who had 50 or more targets. Just because he has these tools at his disposal doesn't mean he's a one-trick pony. Believe it or not, he was the 14th best wide receiver when it comes to his contested catch rate. So even if he's not fully open, he's the type of player who can still go up and get after the football and turn these tough targets into receptions. He also has the benefit of playing with Russell Wilson as the quarterback, who provided in his rookie season a top 24 catchable target percentage, which is actually very impressive considering it was their first year playing together, as well as Metcalf bringing a level of speed that Russell Wilson really hasn't seen, at least not in recent years or from a player who's this heavily involved in the offense. The chemistry heading into year 2 should be that much better than it was last season, so it's possible he may not only improve in the amount of targets he receives, but the percentage of them that are deemed catchable are also likely to increase as well. Last season, Metcalf played on 84% of snaps, which was good for second most of rookie receivers. That percentage though was ranked 30th out of all wide receivers though, but from weeks 8 on, DK Metcalf virtually never left the field. He even played in 92% or more of snaps in 5 of his final 9 games, and only 1 game through that same span did he play on under 80% of snaps. While his snaps were up, he was one of the main contributors in this offense. In fact, DK Metcalf was only out-targeted by Tyler Lockett in 4 of those final 9 games. I wouldn't be surprised to see the targets for Metcalf even surpass that of Tyler Lockett, and the difference in targets between those two players was only split by 10 targets last season. Considering Russell Wilson has a strong connection he's built with Tyler Lockett, it says a lot considering he did feel comfortable even in year 1 targeting him consistently and heavily. Now understandably, this is an offense that overall isn't going to have a ton of passing volume. The Seattle Seahawks do want to run the ball as much as they can, but if anything were to happen to Chris Carson, who's coming off of a hip injury, Carlos Hyde is going to be the main rusher out of the backfield. Rashad Penny likely to start the season on the pup, and if this backfield is led by Carlos Hyde, it's unlikely to produce at the same level of efficiency, which could ultimately provide an outcome of a more pass-friendly approach. Currently, DK Metcalf is coming off the board as the wide receiver 26. He finished last season as a rookie as wide receiver 33, and we definitely believe DK Metcalf can take a massive step forward, much more so than a finishing of wide receiver 26. Like we said, we do have him ranked as wide receiver 20, several spots above ADP, and there are a few wide receivers ranked between 20th and 30th that, if everything goes their way, provide more upside than DK Metcalf does for 2020. But guys, that's going to do it for this video. Let us know who are the players that you're most excited for the 2020 season. If you did enjoy, please hit that like button. If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. We thank you all for watching. We'll catch you on the next one.